Hi everyone, I'm Darshana. So today I wanted to talk about a rather contemporary issue regarding COVID-19 and the supposed mitigation measures or the implications of the supposed mitigation measures taken by uh, governments all around the world. So I'm in Sri Lanka and I am currently experiencing the COVID mitigation measures taken by the Sri Lankan government. But I think most of these the points that I want to highlight are relevant for many states around the world. Right? And I came across this particular article. Let me share the uh, this particular article by Professor Jayant Bhattacharya, or sometimes called J. Bhattacharya from Stanford University. I think he's I guess a authoritative figure, if I may say so, regarding this particular subject um, because he's also he's both a medical professor as well as a professor, or like he has a PhD in economics as well. So because of that, I think he can look at this issue from two different angles, one from the medical side of it, and also from the economic and social side of it. And I think I'll share this particular article in the description, and I think it raises some important issues regarding managing COVID. I mean, the measures taken by governments all around the world in managing COVID or combating COVID. One is that, one issue that he highlights is whether the fatality rate, that is the rate of people, percentage of people who actually die from COVID, from those who are infected, whether that was kind of exaggerated in the beginning, right? Which kind of justified the lockdowns and all these drastic measures taken by the governments, because I think he highlights that currently the fatality rate is close to zero point 0.2 or 0.3%, and it can be even lower. That is the percentage of people who die from COVID after getting infected. So in comparison, if you look at the case fatality rate of flu, the influenza virus, it's I think around 0.1%, right? So whether this reaction uh, justifies the threat posed by this particular virus. That's one thing that he raises, right? Because any reaction that we take, any mitigative mitigation measure that we take should be proportional to the threat, right? So that's one thing that he raises, and I think this case fatal rate could be even lower, because we may never know all the people who are infected, because apparently COVID doesn't show any symptoms in most people, right? And the number of cases is directly proportional to the number of tests conducted, and the tests may also have false positives, false negatives, and so on. So we may never know the actual number of people who are infected, or who got better after getting COVID, right? So the case fatality rate may be much lower than the official number. And the other thing that he highlights is whether this was taken into account, right? When governments take these drastic measures of controlling movement and travel, and imposing lockdown zones and all that, closing down schools, whether those data, whether it was really a data driven approach, right? Or an informed approach, or actually a scientific approach, because most people who justify these measures, government officials and also politicians, they always claim that they stand by science, but if you really look at the data, whether that really justifies these actions. So that's one thing that he highlights. And the other thing is, now the risk of COVID may not be uniform among all age groups and genders and even nationalities or ethnic groups. So there seems to be like drastic differences in how it affects different demographies. Particularly for young people, it seems that the again the case fatal rate is much lower than even with even compared to flu, right? But we never closed down schools for flu, because of flu, the influenza virus. So why are we closing down the schools, right? Because young people are very much affected by the lockdowns and the social isolation, because it affects their growth and the psychological development, social development, and education, and all those things. I think young people are the ones who are paying the greatest price, because they are the most active, they are the most mobile, and they are kind of being restricted because of a risk that is not there for them actually. So um, and the other factor that he highlights is whether, I mean, usually when you argue for lockdowns or any other drastic measures, one argument that we always say is that, okay, if you don't do this, many people will die, right? So whether you want to really have that many people killed, or so it's always this binary argument that it's either or, either you lock down or many people die. But he highlights that it's not really the case, because many people can die from lockdowns as well, due to the economic hardships, due to the increased poverty, hunger, and all those things. Usually the people that are most affected by are the most underprivileged and low income groups in the society, and usually they don't have a bigger voice in social media or in the decision making process. The people who make the decisions are usually the government officials or politicians. So they are basically, they have secured incomes from public money, but the people who are most affected are they don't have any say in these decisions, right? So I found this article by UNICEF, which claimed that around 120 to 140 million additional children will in different households. So when we say children, I mean it may include their parents and the entire family, will lose their, like, will will be unable to meet their basic needs due to the pandemic. So it's not really due to the pandemic, it's due to, mostly due to the pandemic related restrictions imposed by the states, right? So that means, I mean, when you have that kind of effect, so that can increase hunger, that can increase the uh, probability of dying from other diseases, right? That can you know, that can affect the immunity of people, the mental health of people. So one effect is the mental health issue, because throughout the world, I mean, it is estimated that there's a drastic effect on mental health of people, because usually people are not meant to live in isolation. So because humans are they are they human species is a social species. So so those other measures, and also the due to the, like so there's sort of a reductionism when it comes to COVID, that we tend to ignore everything else, and we preventing COVID or mitigating COVID seems to be the only objective of the entire human existence throughout last year, and it's still continuing, right? So there's a reductionist approach. There's COVID there's a COVID reductionism in play in the political or social landscape, which kind of ignores the other. I mean, so even in Sri Lanka, I think some state hospitals are like dedicated as COVID treatment centers, and I mean, we never know what happened to the people who are already admitted there for due to other illnesses, only illness, and there are so many other chronic illnesses that affect people, right? So whether we don't know whether, I mean, how many people died related to um, the lockdown. So I mean, uh, because they were unable to access healthcare, because anyway healthcare resources are scarce, right? So if you dedicate all the resources to one particular disease, which may not be that deadly, right, after all, that can increase the fatality due to other particularly chronic illnesses and even other epidemics. Now in Sri Lanka, every year many people die from uh, you know illnesses like dengue, but this year we didn't hear anything about that. So I don't think nobody died from dengue this year, but maybe just that the attention was not there, right? So on that, so there were not no media reports, so people are not generally interested in that, right? So, and also, I mean, people might delay their regular checkups, and those, particularly those who have chronic illnesses. So the other health effects, I mean, it's not either or problem. And many people can get affected, definitely they get affected, and there can be additional health issues that get created, particularly among vulnerable groups like elderly and young people, infants or pregnant women, right? Due to the lockdowns, right? They may not get their necessary health care or nutrition because all these restrictions. So he's actually, yeah, pointing out these things. And actually this is not a fringe argument. Apparently, I mean, he has created a petition or kind of a declaration, and I saw somewhere that around 40,000 healthcare professionals and scientists from around the world have signed that, right? Yeah, 43,000. So I'll share this document with you, which is not a small number. But we don't hear these kind of arguments in the media or from the people who are making these decisions, the healthcare officials from the healthcare establishment, because I think they are a real minority, but they have more power, right? To take some kind of official in a health ministry, so they yield a lot of power, right? And they don't really interact with patients usually. They may have interacted like many decades back, but now they are basically government officials with a guaranteed income, and same goes for politicians. So that's this reductionist approach is doing a lot of harm. So that's basically what I wanted to highlight. And this is another article that I found regarding a petition filed by uh, group of doctors, like around 500 doctors in Victoria, I mean, um, urging the governor there to take a more holistic approach, right? Get to get rid of this reductionist approach, right? To because apparently the lockdowns can be causing a lot of harm, right? And take a more pragmatic and holistic approach. Now some governments have taken that, like I think countries like Japan have, or even Taiwan, they have taken a holistic approach though. So they have dealt with the disease in a more pragmatic way, and without shutting down the entire country or the economy, without causing enormous economic calamity, right, or social harm, right? So yeah, that's one thing. And there are other implications of this reductionist approach. That is, many states are now printing money and basically handing out money to their citizens. Many countries are basically printing money and handing out money to their citizens, and they are losing their government revenue, tax revenue, because of less economic activity. And as a result, so they are piling up on debt, right? And some, maybe the international financiers might like that, because when the public debt goes up, usually that means it's good for most international finances, because they can lend more money. But so this is another issue, right? So if you look at the US, like last year there has been a huge spike in debt, right? So this can affect inflation, this can affect um, uh, this can create all sorts of problems for the governments, right? And yeah, so that is another thing that we have to keep in mind, because I think even in Sri Lanka, the government debt, so Sri Lankan government accumulated 1 trillion of debt within the first 6 months of 2020. So this may not be entirely due to COVID, because even anyway the Sri Lankan economy was not performing that well. But if you look at, so the total government debt is for 414 trillion. That is throughout the entire history of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has accumulated 14 trillion of debt, and 1 trillion was added just within the first 6 months of 2020, right? So this means COVID may have played a significant role in that, because of the loss of revenue, uh, partly, I mean, for the most part due to the restrictions, I guess, travel restrictions and all that. So the other thing is that the lockdowns and restrictions, social restrictions, mostly affect the small and medium businesses. They do affect large corporations. Sometimes they help the large corporations because they can actually large corporations can actually face that situation because they have a lot of capital and they can always they have strong connections with the governments and so on. So they are better prepared to face the situation, and they might use this opportunity to get rid of the competition from small and medium scale players. So you can see that now the overall trend is that the economy or the capital gets more centralized, right? Small and medium scale players get wiped out, and very large scale private corporations can are the ones that are left, right? And even at the state level, when the government debt piles up, the international financiers, will accumulate more wealth. So I mean, the entire global economy is sort of getting more centralized, with the nation state or national economies getting more weakened. So yeah, that is a trend that we can observe due to COVID, and uh, even the IMF head, can't pronounce her name, so she has actually admitted, she is actually not admitted, she is actually called this a great reset in terms of economy. So it's sort of an economic reset, right? It's not just a pandemic, it's a reset of the global economy, that the economy gets more centralized, more globalized, with the nation states getting weaker because of less production and increased government debt, right? And she has actually said that the due to these current measures, there are more there's more debt, bigger deficits, more unemployment, right? More inequality, more poverty. So those are like admitted by even by the IMF chief, and I mean, who's seen as authoritative figure in terms of world economy. And what she is proposing is basically fiscal stimulus, right, as a solution. So it's like kind of, I'm a bit skeptical about that solution, because I think we all also what happened in Greece, in Ukraine, the so-called stimulus packages actually worsened the issue, and created more deficit and more hardships for the people. But anyway, I mean, the fact that she's admitting that this is as a great economic reset is something to note, right? I mean, if she says that, I think that is true. So it's, I mean, but when we take this reductionist approach, we kind of tend to ignore that, right? Because our entire existence, if our entire existence of the human race is centered upon preventing COVID or combating COVID, so we can't really see this as a result, this great economic reset happening. It's a globalized economy, more globalized economy emerging, which has which can create more inequality, more economic suppression or oppression. The other thing that I want to highlight is the effect on democracy and human rights. So human rights is kind of a loaded term these days, because mostly, I mean, it has a bad rep, I guess, because many countries, especially the liberal Western countries, they use it kind of for political gain. So they would apply it selectively for certain countries whenever it fits their agenda. But I think the notion of human rights has a very important utility within a state, right? Within a state, so that's the only legal concept that hinders, puts a barrier on the state power. It prevents the state from completely overriding the individual, um, and like taking over the individual, and like making a citizen subservient to the state. So that is, I think, an important utility in human rights that we have to acknowledge. So, and if you talk about the democratic rights and the constitutional rights, right? In many democratic states, people have the right to freely assemble, religious freedom, and freedom of movement, freedom of entering the country without any barriers, right? So almost all of these fundamental rights and fundamental constitutional rights and constitutional principles have been violated. Definitely in Sri Lanka they have been violated all over the place, and I mean nobody even talks about those things anymore, because apparently preventing COVID supersedes everything, right? Supersedes the constitution. So which is questionable, because the whole idea of having a constitution is to prevent the state from to put some restrictions on the state power, and the idea that you can override them in an emergency makes the constitution meaningless, right? Because in a normalcy, when there's normalcy anyway, there won't be any need to even have a constitution, because everything is normal. But you need a constitution when there's an emergency. So that is again a trend that is observed all over the world, where people, the rulers, become sort of a ruling class, right? And sometimes these rules don't apply for them or their friends. I mean, we have seen this in Sri Lanka, but even in the West, right? So we have this notion that in the West things are more fair, but with respect to COVID related restrictions, in many Western countries we have seen double standard in applying these rules, even for the police, right? Not even for the political class. So that has created a very kind of the political power too has become centralized, because what democracy does is, to a certain extent, it gives the individual or the society more political power, and it kind of balances out the power that is with the political class. But we have seen that the balance have disappeared, and the political class, the ruling class, has become very kind of omnipotent, sort of, and they can basically do anything, and they just have to say that they are preventing COVID, and they can basically do anything, right? There has been a lot of militarization in again, not only in Sri Lanka, in many countries, uh, of the civil administration, with the excuse of preventing COVID, right? But with most government initiatives, those are not temporary, right? I mean, they will get introduced as temporary measures, but eventually they will be permanent. So that is another thing that we can observe, that on one hand the economic activity is getting more centralized, and the wealth is getting more centralized, where you have a two-class society of haves and have-nots. The middle class is getting vanished. On the other hand, the political power too is getting centralized to sometimes unelected officials, healthcare officials. So sometimes the politicians become a ruling class, right? And they yield a lot of powers, and usually people like that, right? I mean, when you have power, you need to have unchecked power, and this has become sort of a very nice opportunity for the political class. I think it's Winston Churchill who said, "Never let a good can't really recall that called, never let a good disaster, um, uh, never let a good catastrophe, uh, can't recall it. Yeah, never let a good crisis go to waste." That's what Winston Churchill said. So that we can see that increasingly, it is increasing apparent that when you have more wealth or power, usually people tend to accumulate more wealth and more power. So COVID has given a perfect opportunity to the people who want to do that, right? So but all this is one thing. I mean, if you really want to do that, then having a reductionist approach for COVID management rather than a holistic approach um, is justifiable, because then you can justify anything under the guise of preventing COVID. On the other hand, I think even among the general public, that maybe due to the media influence, I mean, everybody is so concerned about uh, COVID prevention, and the entire all human social interactions and all human activities are um, reduced to this one thing, which is something that has never happened in the history of entire human all civilization. I don't think it has ever happened before, and if it has ever happened, then the outcomes would not have been very nice. So it has put the entire human species into a very tricky spot, I think. um, um, so that's basically what I wanted to highlight. I mean, I think one thing to, so one might question, so what can we do about it? So I think the first thing is to being aware of it, that there is a reductionism. There's some reductionist approach going on related to COVID, and we need to take a more holistic approach, and you can democratically raise your opinion, and make your voice heard. And I think that is the best thing that we can do, being aware of it, then basically expressing yourself uh, about on this issue, and then so that can actually eventually have an effect, I think. But it's a very challenging time, I think, for everyone. It will be a very challenging time for at least several years to come, because it seems that this particular trend of this reductionist approach doesn't seem to um, um, it seems it's here to stay for a while, right? Until the public becomes more aware, and things sort of think outside the box, so to speak. I mean, the box given by provided by the mainstream media and the healthcare establishment and the political establishment. So I think this is apparent even with this uh, very increased in very uh, the, this even regarding this early treatment. I think there's a huge animosity, like kind of a, I don't know, it's very hard to explain that most states, most governments would be very reluctant to look into treatment, particularly early treatment, but they are very, very eager to look at all these social control measures, like putting a mask on everybody, mask mandating, and travel bans and lockdowns, and even vaccines, because vaccines, you can like theoretically you can impose a vaccine, or you can have an indirect mandate by like imposing, um, making it mandatory to have a vaccine if you are going to travel or something like that. So all these social measures are pushed by governments, but most governments are very reluctant on early treatment, especially in Sri Lanka, and even in countries, particularly in countries where these where there are drastic measures, right? Uh, so like liberal or socialist kind of countries, leftist countries. Now, some people think that most people think that currently Sri Lanka has a nationalist government, or a conservative government, national. But I think it's more like a leftist government, because the COVID management policy is very similar to what the um, leftist liberal leaning kind of governments are doing all around the world. So yeah, so these very um, lack of interest in, or sometimes directly like putting some hindrances, administrative hindrances on treatment in different medical systems. It doesn't have to be Western medicine only, but in any healthcare system. But there's a distinct lack of interest and lack of support on that, but rather on having vaccination on everyone. Because if there's a cheap and available treatment, early treatment, effective treatment for COVID, then you would not need such drastic measures, including mass vaccination or any most of these drastic measures, right? So I will share some links in the description to support that argument, right? So with that, I'd like to conclude, and thanks for connecting, and do share your comments and thoughts in the comments, and see you again with a similar video. Thank you.